Good morning, friends. What a passage we have today. God, what are you doing? It's the question that I have in my mind as I think about what we just read together, what Kurt read for us this morning. It reminds me of this story, but in C.S. Lewis's book, The Lion, the Witch, and the Wardrobe, there's this moment where one of the children asks a question about Aslan, and Aslan in this story is the lion. He's the king of Narnia. Aslan also happens to be one of this archetype of God in C.S. Lewis's book. But when the children first hear talk about Aslan, Susan asks, is he quite safe? She wonders, is he safe? And if you remember the book, the beaver, Mr. Beaver, he replies back with something so profound. He says, safe? Who said anything about safe? Of course he isn't safe, but he's good. He's the king. This line has really been hitting me this week because it captures an aspect of God that we see in our text. And it's sometimes uncomfortable to deal with. It's an aspect of God that Jacob comes face to face with as he wrestles with him in the evening when he was all alone. The idea that God is not tamed by our wants or our sensibilities. That God is one who cannot be controlled or manipulated can be a difficult thing for us to wrap our minds around. But as we'll see in the text, and like the good beaver said, God is not safe, but still, through and through his actions, he's good. And so let's get our Bibles open, if we haven't already, to the book of Genesis, chapter 32. For the past few months, we've been going and following through this story of Jacob. And so just to catch us up where we're at today, it's been 20 years since Jacob has fled his hometown of Canaan for fear of his life as his brother Esau has vowed to kill him. Now, since Jacob has left Canaan, he's really built a life for himself. Last week, we talked about the wealth that Jacob had amassed when he was working with his father-in-law Laban. And chapter 31 is pretty chaotic, but it ends with Laban chasing after Jacob because Jacob is just fleeing from Laban. And after they have this heated exchange, Laban actually ends up relenting and he gives up. He lets go of chasing after Jacob. He says goodbye to his family. And basically, he and Jacob make this agreement, let's just get out of one another's ways. You go this way, I go this way. Let's set up stones, all right? You go here, I'll go here. See ya. And this is where Genesis 32 begins. Jacob is now in the wilderness. He's en route back to his home in Canaan. And he's on this journey back home. And what do you suppose is on Jacob's mind? He's going back home. What is he thinking? Maybe he's thinking about the weather. But more likely than not, Jacob's mind is probably consumed with the concern over returning back to his home and meeting his brother face to face. This is a big deal for him. To head back home means that Jacob is going to have to face the music. In many ways, to return home means returning to the mess that he's made relationally with his family and particularly with his brother Esau. And so to prepare for this meeting, Jacob sends messengers to connect with Esau ahead of him. And check out what he sends in verse 4. The message that he gives, Jacob says, I have sojourned with Laban and stayed until now. I have oxen, donkeys, flocks, male servants, and female servants. I have sent to tell my Lord in order that I may find favor in your sight. What is Jacob trying to do here? I imagine that for those of us with siblings, you could probably pick up on this pretty quick. I think of moments of growing up with my siblings and the very few arguments I ever had with them in my lifetime. It was always awkward to think that if I ever got in an argument with one of my siblings, that at some moment we were going to have to see each other again. Whether that was at the dinner table, which is where most of those arguments kind of found their resolution, or in the car on the way to school or church, we would see each other again after an argument. And if I was the cause of a particularly horrible fight, which rarely happened, if I felt remorse, I might try to find a way to soften the blow and lessen my sibling's anger. For example, if I saw my brother and sister again at the dinner table and the food was served, I might not be the first person to reach for the food. I might be like, go ahead, please, after you. You want some more? Or if our parents would ask, well, who's going to do the dishes tonight? If I felt especially guilty, I might jump and volunteer myself as tribute. But that's what Jacob is doing here in this passage. In the message that Jacob sends to Esau, you could see his posture of apprehension and even remorse. Looking at verse 5, Jacob says, I have oxen, I have donkeys, I have flocks, male servants and female servants. In his message, Jacob talks about all of the possessions he has, maybe as a way of dangling them in front of his brother, that these are possibly up for the taking. Hey, you need anything? You need some flock? Or maybe as a way to say, hey, look, I've got a lot now. I don't have to steal from you. But take a look at what he says at the end of verse 5. He says, I've sent to tell my Lord in order that I may find favor in your sight. Jacob seems to express his desire to make things right as he respectfully addresses Esau as my Lord, and he shares his intention of finding favor with him. Now, this message that he sends ahead of him reaches its destination, and verse 6 mentions that the messengers return with some news. Yay! The news is, yes, Jacob, message received. Esau is coming to meet you, and there are 400 men with him. Well, this is jarring, right? Because messengers bring back news, and the news isn't particularly helpful. If I was in Jacob's shoes and I heard that Esau was coming and there's 400 men with him, I might think, great, Esau is up for a discussion. Wait, he also has 400 men with him? Did you happen to look at any of their faces? Are they mad? Are they happy? Are they carrying flowers? Obviously, from the text, Jacob doesn't hear the news of the multitude of men that are coming to meet with him as if it's some extravagant welcome home party. Genesis 32 records that Jacob, as a result, is actually greatly afraid. He's distressed upon hearing it. And so pausing there for a second, what would you do if you were in Jacob's shoes? Because if you think about how Jacob found himself in this current predicament, he was actually being obedient to the Lord. Jacob was commanded by God to return to a land and a situation where his past sins had really complicated things. To be obedient to the Lord in this instance, and then to hear that 400 men are coming to meet you, and one of them is your brother that you stole from, well, this leaves Jacob scrambling. Jacob does what any reasonable human under great stress over uncertainty would do, and he comes up with a survival plan in verses 7 through 9. In these verses, Jacob's plan is to divide his party into two different groups in hopes that if Esau attacked one group, the other group would have a chance to survive. Now, you might be thinking, well, that's a great plan, Jacob. How wonderful that you're actually thinking like so selflessly. Well, just have you know, sometime read through Genesis 32 in its entirety this week, and you'll find Jacob puts himself at the very back of that line. So the verdict's still out on Jacob. But here's the thing I want to point out, though. There is something valuable to point out about Jacob's interaction here. Unlike other challenges that Jacob has faced in his past, he does something that is out of the ordinary. In the moments of his fear and distress, after he has done his initial planning, what does he do? He prays to God. And this is a little uncharacteristic for Jacob, as the last time that we see him actually communicating to God is in Genesis 28. If you remember when we went over Genesis 28, Jacob responds to God by saying, if God will be with me and will keep me, then the Lord shall be my God. Now, these words are surely going to be put to the test, as Jacob has to be wondering, in the midst of what I'm going to face as I return back home, will God indeed keep me? Is he going to keep me? This prayer is uncharacteristic for Jacob because, if anything, out of fear, what we've seen in Jacob, it wouldn't be uncommon for Jacob to have come up with some sort of excuse or some sort of plan to avoid Esau. He could have made some convenient excuse to avoid the conflict that was waiting for him upon this return. But you see, instead of Jacob trying to swindle his way out of this situation, Jacob, for the first time, goes to God. He prays. And unlike the first time he prays, this one isn't conditional. This one seems more genuine. It seems to be prayed in humility and in faith. Let's read Jacob's prayer in verses 9 through 12 together. But Jacob said, O God of my father Abraham and God of my father Isaac, O Lord, who said to me, return to your country and to your kindred that I may do you good. I am not worthy of the least of all the deeds of steadfast love and all the faithfulness that you've shown to your servant. For with only my staff I crossed this Jordan, and now I have become two camps. Please deliver me from the hand of my brother, from the hand of Esau, for I fear him, that he may come and attack me, the mothers with the children. But you said, I will surely do you good and make your offspring as the sand of the sea, which cannot be numbered for multitude. I find Jacob's prayer beautifully genuine and honest. In verse 10, he expresses a healthy understanding of where he stands in relation to God's blessing as he says, I'm not worthy of all the deeds of steadfast love and faithfulness that you've shown to your servant. He shares his fear of the uncertainty that stands before him in verse 11, and then he pleads with God in verse 12, remember your promises. It's here where we begin to see a shift in Jacob's life. For a moment, Jacob isn't relying on himself. He isn't relying on his own strategy or his own cunning to get him out of this situation. But in this prayer, he turns towards God. Now, there's a lot that we can learn from Jacob's prayer as it's really this wrestling match with God before the actual physical wrestling match to come in the next section. But out of Jacob's concerns and fears, he alludes to the God of his forefathers and eventually comes to a place where he prays something like, God, you have promised me. Please deliver on your promise. Jacob's prayer shows us that his faith in God is beginning to grow some roots. Now, this doesn't mean that he's completely changed, because as we're going to read along, we're going to see that Jacob is still really Jacob. He's still Jacob, but this is a great start. Because it's in this tension between Jacob's faith in God and his own self-reliance that God is actually going to step in and bring him to a place of surrender. And so looking at verses 22 to 31 now today, this passage that we've read together, this section begins in the evening with Jacob, and he's moving his plans along. He sends out his family before him, and he sends out his herds and droves. He splits the camp, and ultimately he finds himself alone in verse 24. Now, I don't want us to gloss over the importance of this detail that Jacob was all alone. Because at this point in the narrative, there is nothing left for Jacob to plan. The plan's already in motion. There was no resource or possession present to distract him. There was no one to talk to. And for all intents and purposes, Jacob, in this instance, was all alone. And that's when things take an interesting turn. I've always found this story mildly weird and slightly humorous, because this man comes out of nowhere while Jacob is alone. There's no dialogue recorded between them that we see. There's no setup for who this man is yet. And once this man enters into Jacob's lonely space, what do? They just wrestle all evening long. Verse 24 says, Jacob was left alone, and a man wrestled with him until the breaking of the day. One of the first questions that may come to our minds in this passage is, who is this man? Who is this guy? There's no introduction from the get-go. At this point in the narrative, Jacob doesn't know who his opponent is. And frankly, as readers, neither do we. We don't know who this person is yet. It isn't until later on in verses 28 and 30 where we figure out who this stranger really is. And so, spoiler alert, you can mark down verses 28 and 30. Spoiler alert, the stranger is God. We find this out later, but here's God, and again, he's meeting Jacob in a time of great need. And so going back to our text, as God is wrestling with Jacob, at some point in their bout, verse 25 continues by pointing out that in their wrestling, when God saw that he did not prevail against Jacob, he touched his hip socket, and his hip was put out of joint as he wrestled with him. I'm going to do a quick aside here. If you ever want to go in a deep dive, Pastor Chris has a lot of fun things to say about this passage. He'd love to talk to you about it one of these days. It was a fun little loop for me this week. But anyways, God touched Jacob's hip socket. Jacob's hip was put out of joint as he wrestled with him. Now, what we learn about this wrestling match so far is that Jacob is stubborn, but he's putting up a fight. He's putting up a fight against God. And so as our text reads, God saw Jacob's persistence, and out of a response, he touches Jacob's hip socket and he puts it out of joint. Now you would think that this would end the match immediately, but it doesn't. Because even after Jacob's hip is dislocated, Jacob refuses to let go in verse 26, saying, I will not let you go unless you bless me. I will not let you go unless you bless me. And this is where my heart is so affectionately drawn towards Jacob. Because for all of Jacob's life, what do we know about him? From our perspective, we've been introduced to Jacob as this deceiver, as this liar, as this cheater. And all throughout the telling of his story, he's made plenty of poor decisions. And yet here in this place, it doesn't say this explicitly, but this is a turning point for Jacob in his life and his faith. This isn't written directly in the text, but different scholars and commentators on this passage would point to this moment here in verses 25 and 26 as an aha moment for Jacob and his faith. Why? Because for starters, this is probably where Jacob realizes just who he is wrestling with. In this moment, Jacob has been wrestling with God for a good amount of time. And can you just imagine being locked into a battle with someone or a wrestling match with someone, and then all of a sudden, with a slight touch, as I believe the Hebrew implies, Jacob's hip is struck and is out of place. He comes to a realization, at the very least, this guy's got something. It reminds me of a story about a couple of months ago. Our family was having dinner with my father-in-law, and I can't remember who said it, kids, but one of our kids challenged my father-in-law to an arm wrestling match. Have you guys ever done that with Grandpa? But one of our kids challenged him, and my father-in-law, who's already a silly goose to begin with, but he obliges, and he ends up challenging all four of our kids to an arm wrestling match, and one by one, our kids lock arms with their appa, right? And he does this thing. This has got to be a thing that every older dad or grandpa has done when you're arm wrestling with a kid. As they're wrestling, what does he do? He starts to go, you're so strong, right? And then his hand gets just about to the end of the table where he's going to lose. And then the kids respond how? Come on, they're super excited. I'm going to beat our Harabuji. He's going down. And it's in that moment where he flips the switch. He goes from, you're going to beat me. And then that, changes to, And then all of a sudden, he beats them and overpowers them, if I may add, effortlessly. When God merely touches Jacob's hip and puts him out of place, God displays a sliver of his omnipotence. And in that moment, Jacob realizes exactly who he's been wrestling with. Jacob realizes that he's now wrestling physically with the God who has promised him blessing. In his arms is the God he was just praying to. This is why Jacob doesn't let go. The attitude of his heart towards God is revealed, as he says in verse 26, I will not let you go unless you bless me. The prophet Hosea retells this instance in Jacob's life and the intensity of this wrestling match with God. As I read Hosea chapter 12 for us really quickly, notice how emotionally charged this moment must have been as Hosea writes, "In the womb, Jacob took his brother by the heel, and in his manhood he strove with God. He strove with the angel and prevailed. He wept, and he sought his favor." And so here in this passage, here's Jacob, his hip is dislocated. And I just imagine a man in tears. He's beat up, grappling with God, and he's saying, "I'm not letting you go." The idea behind Jacob's holding on to God is that he realizes that his salvation rests on the person who he's currently locked in with. He doesn't need a birthright. He doesn't need his father's favor. He needed God. To further understand what Jacob was doing as he stayed locked in with God in this grapple, one pastor summed it up very beautifully when he said, Jacob was trying to wrestle forgiveness and help from the Lord. He was doing physically what all of us do spiritually when we earnestly pray, pleading with God for mercy and begging him for it. Going back to our story in Genesis 32, God responds to Jacob's persistence in verses 27 onward and blessing Jacob and assuring him that his prayer has been answered. Looking at verse 27, God says, "What is your name?" And he said, "Jacob." Then he said, "Your name shall no longer be called Jacob, but Israel, for you have striven with God and with men and have prevailed." God declares that no longer is Jacob to be known as Jacob. He is now to be called Israel. And in one way, this is significant because if you remember the meaning of Jacob's name at the get-go, he goes from the one who grasps the heel, the one who is the deceiver who supplants another. This was his identity. He goes from that now to the one who has struggled with God and yet has prevailed. Jacob has prevailed over God as God gives to Jacob what he has had to cheat and steal from others his whole life, this blessing. As Jacob receives the name Israel, our passage closes in verse 30 with Jacob naming the place of this wrestling Peniel. And notice what Jacob says at the conclusion of this passage. He says, "For I've seen God face to face, and yet my life has been delivered." Jacob realizes that this encounter that he's had with God is an act of grace. All right? This is an act of grace. Why? Because God could have done so much more to him apart from causing him to limp for the rest of his life. Surely God could have poured out his judgment and wrath upon Jacob for the unworthiness he mentioned earlier in this prayer. And yet, Jacob receives blessing from God. And not only that, he walks away with only a limp. I don't know what the image is that you guys get in your head as you think about Jacob wrestling with the Lord. It's not what I think like people do wrestling in high school where they just like, I don't think it's that. I think Jacob really got beat up. I mean, he's limping for the rest of his life. I've seen God face to face, and yet my life has been delivered. A blessing for sure. There's a fun quote by Tim Keller, and he says, "God only jumps you to bless you." But friends, as we begin to wrap up our time together and close, there are a couple things that I want to leave us with to reflect on this week as we take in this message from Genesis 32. The first one comes in the form of this question. How are you when it comes to being alone with God? This might seem like an odd question, but Jacob encounters God in a moment where he is alone. And this plays an important role in the story and life of Jacob because for all of Jacob's life, he was someone who at times would use others to get what he wanted. Though Jacob realized that both his father and his grandfather were blessed, his focus was so much on the blessing as opposed to the person behind the blessing. And this might sound cheesy, but there's something in this passage that begs for us as believers to consider that sometimes our moments alone with God could be pretty disconcerting because maybe when we're alone with God, we realize we don't really know who he is. We don't really have a relationship with him. Or maybe, just like Jacob, our relationship with God at best is contractual. Think about a distant relative who gives amazing gifts. Maybe you look forward to the gifts that you might receive from them, only to find that when you're in a room alone with them, you've got nothing to talk about because you don't really have a relationship with them. And if that's the case, I want to encourage you, though, with this second thought. Even as we may have a hard time being alone with God, remember, God wrestles with us in our own stubbornness. Genesis 32 teaches us that God is willing to wrestle with the stubbornness and self-reliance of Jacob. And he does so with each and every single one of us. In this story, we see the image of a God who takes the L, or he loses this match to Jacob. And at first glance, when we think about God conceding to Jacob, it's bothersome to think that God would lose this match in one way to Jacob. But take a moment to realize that God lowered himself and loses ultimately so that Jacob could win. Jacob could win, not more points towards his pride or his possessions. He's not walking away from this battle going, look, I just beat the Lord. He said, I survived. God lowered himself so that Jacob could win a blessing that would ultimately transform his life and lead future generations to encounter God in a similar manner. And maybe you could see where I'm going with this, but in this interaction, we see this image of God who does something so odd. Like, God, why don't you just change Jacob's heart altogether? Why don't you just transform him? Why wrestle? Why put his hip out of joint? Maybe it's because God's not safe, but he's good. God is real and doesn't do what we command him to do. And instead, God shows us that his plans are far above our own, and that in his dislocating of Jacob's hip and causing this sense of suffering, God saves Jacob from a worse fate should Jacob continue to live his life in self-reliance and deceit. Through Jacob's pain and his newfound limp, God communicated to him the blessing of salvation that he had been looking for in all the wrong places. Through Christ's suffering and death, God communicates a way for us, sinners like you and I, to have salvation. Jesus loses his life so that we could live. Friends, salvation with God is something sweeter than any other pursuits and gifts we might be chasing for in this life. And so how are you when you are alone with the Lord? And consider that we serve a God who still wrestles with us, even in our stubbornness. Let's pray. God, we're so grateful that you are a God who wrestles with us, even in the midst of our own stubbornness and self-reliance. Lord, we ask for your help this week to break down our pride, to reorient our passion should our pride or passion draw us further away from you. Thank you for your son, Jesus, who laid down his life in such a humbling way so that we could receive the blessing of being called your sons and daughters. We love you, Lord, and we lift your name up. Amen.